300 million albums sold worldwide. 8 consecutive #1 albums. They crushed Beatles-held box office records. 115,000 fans at a single show. They didn't just dominate the 70s, they invented what arena rock could be. Then, silence. A 5-year-old child dead from a stomach virus. A drummer choking on his own vomit after 40 shots of vodka. Criminal assault charges filed backstage at their biggest show. 4 brothers who created lightning in a bottle, torn apart by tragedies so devastating they could never step on stage together again. Not for money. Not for fans. Not ever. 45 years later, they still refuse. No reunion. No nostalgia tour. No final payday. This is the story of how the biggest rock band of the 70s was destroyed not by ego or greed, but by grief, and a bond so sacred that when one piece was lost, the other 3 chose to let the legend die rather than disgrace it. But to understand why they walked away from hundreds of millions of dollars, we have to go back to London, 1968. In the late 1960s, London's music scene was exploding. Rock wasn't just entertainment, it was revolution. While established acts played it safe, a few musicians were pushing blues rock into heavier, darker territory. Jimmy Page had already tasted success as a member of the Yardbirds, a respected British rock band. But by 1968, the Yardbirds were falling apart. Page found himself with a problem: contractual obligations to fulfill tour dates with a band that no longer existed. His solution? Build something entirely new. He brought in 3 musicians who would change rock history. Robert Plant became the voice, a golden-haired frontman with a voice that could soar from whisper to wail. John Paul Jones was the craftsman, a multi-instrumentalist and arranger who brought sophistication to raw power. John Bonham was the engine, a drummer whose thunderous style would redefine what rhythm could do in rock music. They initially called themselves the New Yardbirds, fulfilling those leftover obligations. But the name wouldn't last. Legend says Keith Moon or John Entwistle joked that the project would go down like a lead balloon. Page loved it. Dropped the from lead so Americans wouldn't mispronounce it. Led Zeppelin was born. What made them different? They weren't just loud, they were dynamic. They could crush you with heavy blues riffs, then transport you with acoustic folk passages. They prioritized albums over singles, an unusual choice when radio hits define success. They avoided releasing their best songs as singles, forcing fans to buy the full album experience. This was album-oriented rock before the term existed. Their first live shows in 1968 generated immediate buzz. When their debut album dropped in January 1969, it stormed into the top 10 in both the UK and US. Their first North American tour, 31 shows across 7 weeks, built a reputation for intensity that preceded them everywhere they went. By July 1969, Atlantic Records was already honoring them for selling over $1 million worth of records. Not bad for a band barely 6 months old. But even in the beginning, the seeds of destruction were already there. The lifestyle was extreme. The touring schedule was relentless. Manager Peter Grant was fiercely protective, creating an us versus them mentality that would later spiral into violence. The pressure to top themselves was building before they'd even reached their peak. And the band's tendency toward excess, the drinking, the parties, the rockstar mythology they were creating, was romanticized by fans but quietly becoming a fault line. The rise was nothing short of explosive. Led Zeppelin II arrived in October 1969, recorded in fragments while they were constantly on the road. It hit #1 on both sides of the Atlantic. Whole Lotta Love became their highest charting single, though they resisted releasing it in the UK, still stubborn about their album-first philosophy. But beneath this triumph, the touring was becoming a machine. No breaks, no rest. Just cities blurring together and crowds getting bigger. Led Zeppelin III in 1970 showed their range, more acoustic, more experimental. Critics were confused. Fans were divided. The band didn't care. They were making music on their terms. What fans didn't see was the pressure cooker building. Fame was accelerating faster than any of them had prepared for. Page was the perfectionist, obsessing over every detail. Plant was the face, handling the spotlight. Jones was the quiet professional, holding the musical foundation together. Bonham was the wild heart, living every rock and roll excess to its fullest. Then came 1971 and their untitled fourth album, the one everyone calls Led Zeppelin IV. Stairway to Heaven wasn't released as a single, yet it became the most requested song in rock radio history. The album sold tens of millions. It became their defining statement. And that's where the trouble began. The bigger they got, the harder it became to be human. The myth was consuming the men. By 1973, they were unstoppable. Houses of the Holy continued their dominance. Their North American tour that summer, 34 shows, shattered attendance and box office records previously held by the Beatles. Variety reported they grossed around $4 million, a staggering sum for the era. Their Madison Square Garden shows were filmed for what would become the Song Remains the Same concert film. The real cost was building quietly. Bonham was drinking more. Page was pushing harder. Plant was being pulled in every direction as the voice and face of the phenomenon. Jones remained steady, but even he felt the strain. They founded their own label, Swan Song Records, in May 1974. It was distributed by Atlantic but gave them control. They signed other acts. They were building an empire. They were in charge now. But what fans celebrated as power, the band experienced as responsibility. More control meant more pressure. More success meant higher expectations. Physical Graffiti dropped in 1975, a sprawling double album that hit #1 immediately. It was their creative and commercial zenith. Critics finally caught up to what fans always knew: this was important music. In May 1975, they staged 5 enormous concerts at Earl's Court Arena in London. When tickets for the first 3 nights sold out in roughly 4 hours, they added 2 more shows. 85,000 people total. It was a coronation. Plant brought back an acoustic set mid-show, proving they could command silence as powerfully as they commanded thunder. Those nights at Earl's Court should have been the peak of everything they'd worked for. Standing ovations. Critical praise. Total domination of rock music. They looked invincible. But that moment of glory was also the beginning of the end. Because while they looked unstoppable on stage, everything off stage was cracking. Just months earlier, in August 1975, Robert Plant had been in a devastating car crash while vacationing in Greece. He suffered broken bones and major injuries. Touring stopped. The invincibility was revealed as an illusion. Plant spent months recovering, and when they returned to recording, it was in a makeshift studio because he couldn't move easily. The resulting album, Presence, released in 1976, was darker and more urgent. You could hear the desperation in it. The band also released The Song Remains the Same film that year, a concert document that was supposed to celebrate their dominance but instead captured a moment already slipping into the past. Plant's recovery was slow. The band's momentum had been interrupted for the first time. When they talked about returning to touring, there was apprehension beneath the excitement. Meanwhile, Jimmy Page's heroin addiction was worsening. The guitar god who crafted those legendary riffs was battling demons that no amount of applause could silence. They decided to mount a massive North American tour in 1977. 51 dates scheduled. This would be their grand return. Their reassertion of dominance. It became a nightmare. The tour kicked off April 1st, and almost immediately things felt wrong. In Cincinnati on April 19th, a gate crash riot erupted with over 70 arrests. Tampa on June 3rd saw a storm cut the concert short, triggering another riot with injuries. The shows themselves were often brilliant, but the atmosphere around the band had become toxic. The excess that once seemed like harmless rock and roll fun had metastasized into something darker. Bonham's drinking was out of control. Page looked gaunt and exhausted. The entourage around them encouraged the worst behaviors. Then came Oakland. July 23, 1977. The Day on the Green Festival. Around 115,000 fans, one of the biggest crowds they'd ever drawn. The show itself went well. But backstage, everything exploded. A confrontation erupted between Peter Grant's security team and Bill Graham's promoter staff. Accounts vary on exactly what triggered it, but what followed was brutal. Physical violence. Assault charges were later filed against Grant, Bonham, and others from the Zeppelin camp. The mythology of the band as untouchable outlaws crossed into something uglier, actual criminality. The tour continued barely. The July 24th show at Oakland, their very next performance, would become historically significant for a reason no one anticipated. It was their last U.S. concert ever. 2 days later, on July 26th, Robert Plant received a phone call that shattered everything. His 5-year-old son, Carrick, had died suddenly from a stomach virus. Plant was in New Orleans. His child was gone. Thousands of miles separated him from his family in their darkest moment. The remaining tour dates were canceled immediately. The band essentially stopped. Not just touring, everything. The brotherhood that had created magic together was broken by grief that words couldn't touch. Plant later said some in the rock press speculated callously about whether the tragedy was karma for the band's excess. That kind of cruelty deepened his devastation. Money frozen? No, they were still wealthy. Charts sliding? Not immediately. But trust? Brotherhood? The will to continue? All shattered. Carrick's death became the irreversible turning point. Everything that came after was just aftermath. For months, the band existed in limbo. Plant grieved privately. Page struggled with his demons. Jones and Bonham waited, unsure if Led Zeppelin would or even should continue. Eventually, quietly, they decided to try. Not because the passion was there, because the alternative was accepting that the dream had died with a 5-year-old boy. They returned to the studio in late 1978 to record in Through the Outdoor. The album was different. More keyboards from Jones, more experimental textures, less of the raw power that had defined them. It released in 1979 and still hit #1 in both the UK and US, but it felt like a band going through motions rather than breaking new ground. In August 1979, they headlined the Knebworth Festival in England. Over 100,000 people attended the first night. The shows were good, but not legendary. The edge was gone. Reviews were mixed. Some fans felt they were watching a band playing their own tribute. They attempted a European tour in 1980, shorter, more restrained. At Nuremberg on June 27th, Bonham collapsed during the show. Exhaustion maybe. Alcohol, definitely. The band finished the tour, but everyone knew something had to change. A North American tour was scheduled for October 1980. This would be their comeback. Their return to America after 3 years away. Rehearsals began at Bray Studios on September 24th. For a moment, it felt like maybe, just maybe, they could recapture something. Not the peak, but something sustainable. A version of Led Zeppelin that could exist in a more mature, controlled form. But the story wasn't over. John Bonham arrived at Jimmy Page's house on September 24, 1980, for those rehearsals. He'd been drinking, which wasn't unusual. He continued drinking throughout the day. Vodka primarily. Lots of it. By evening, Bonham was assisted to a bed at Page's house to sleep it off. Someone checked on him. He was snoring, sleeping on his side. Standard procedure after a heavy session. The next morning, September 25th, John Paul Jones went to wake Bonham. He was dead. The autopsy would reveal Bonham had consumed approximately 40 measures of vodka in roughly 12 hours. He'd choked on his own vomit during the night. Asphyxiation after extreme alcohol intake. No other drugs found in his system, just alcohol. The cause of death was ruled as accidental. John Henry Bonham was 32 years old. The American tour was canceled immediately. But the bigger question loomed. Could Led Zeppelin continue? Rumors swarmed about replacement drummers. Names were floated. Offers made. The music industry assumed they'd find someone and carry on. That's what bands did. The revenue potential was enormous. The demand was there. On December 4, 1980, Led Zeppelin made their choice. They officially disbanded. Their statement was simple and absolute. They could not continue without John Bonham. What they had created was 4 specific people creating something larger than themselves. Replace one element, and it wasn't Led Zeppelin anymore. It was something else wearing their name. This decision, to choose silence over substitution, was radical. Bands didn't do that. Not when they were still at the top. Not when millions of dollars were on the table. Not when fans were begging for more. But Page, Plant, and Jones understood something profound. Authenticity mattered more than legacy management. Led Zeppelin was those four people, or it was nothing. Over the following decades, they faced pressure constantly. Reunion tours, Hall of Fame performances, massive financial offers. They did a few one-off shows, Live Aid in 1985, their Hall of Fame induction in 1995, a legendary single concert in London in 2007. Each time, it was incomplete. Each time, Bonham's son Jason filled in admirably, but it proved the point, it wasn't the same. Led Zeppelin also faced legal battles over copyright claims. Multiple songs were accused of plagiarism. The biggest lawsuit alleged Stairway to Heaven copied Spirit's Taurus. That case dragged through courts for years before Zeppelin ultimately prevailed. But the accusations added complexity to their legacy. The band members pursued solo work with varying success. Plant had the most consistent solo career. Page collaborated with various artists. Jones worked steadily but quietly, but none of it approached what they'd created together. The tragedy wasn't just Bonham's death, it was the reality that lightning captured once couldn't be summoned again. Four men had found perfect chemistry, and when that chemistry was broken, they had the integrity to let it stay broken. Today, Led Zeppelin's legacy is complicated and towering. They've sold an estimated 200 to 300 million records worldwide, making them among the best-selling artists in history. In the US alone, they have over 110 million certified album sales. 5 of their albums have been certified diamond by the RE. They're credited as pioneers who helped lay the foundation for hard rock and heavy metal. Their influence echoes through every generation of rock that followed. Stairway to Heaven remains one of the most iconic songs ever recorded, despite never being released as a single. But there's no active Led Zeppelin. Page occasionally performs. Plant continues touring and recording, often exploring musical directions far from Zeppelin's sound. Jones works on various projects. All three have made peace with what was and what can never be again. Fans still debate, should they have tried harder to continue? Was disbanding the right choice? Could Jason Bonham have made it work permanently? But the members are clear. Led Zeppelin was a specific alchemy of four people. Success created legends, but tragedy revealed the truth underneath. That brotherhood, real brotherhood, means knowing when to stop. That some things are too sacred to replace. The system that built rock gods in the 70s, the endless touring, the encouraged excess, the mythology that addiction was part of genius, destroyed as many bands as it elevated. Led Zeppelin managed to escape that system's complete destruction by making an impossible choice. They walked away. Occasionally, rumors surface. Anniversary tours are speculated. Reunion shows are fantasized about in the music press. But Plant, Page, and Jones have held firm for over 40 years. They know what they had, and they know it can't be recreated. Led Zeppelin rose higher than almost any rock band in history. They fell not through betrayal or ego, but through tragedy and the honest recognition that magic doesn't survive substitution. Their silence after 1980 speaks louder than any reunion tour ever could. What part of this story hits you most? The decision to disband rather than replace Bonham? The tragedy of Carrick Plant's death? The way excess caught up with them at their peak? Drop your thoughts below. And if you want to understand how other legendary bands face their own collapse, from internal warfare to industry betrayal, check out the next video. Hit subscribe, because these stories of rise and fall never get old.